It's 4 o'clock and it's time for the Great War Discussion Group. Our speaker today is Stephen Dietz, and he will be discussing, as you can see from the screen, political cartoons. Political cartoons are an ancient form of expression, I hesitate to say art, dating back to the 18th century when people were printing broadsheets rather than daily newspapers. I think the sophistication of the medium has not really progressed a whole lot since then. Some of you may recall the famous cartoon by Hogarth showing a woman with a calf's head growing out of her back because she'd received a vaccination. Now that I think about it, the political controversies haven't really changed much since the 18th century. But that's a subject for another talk. Stephen, go ahead.
Thank you very much. So, as Charlie said, this is going to be political cartoons. It was originally more of a multimedia, but I found that I was getting scope creep. And as a whole, it was going to be more of a multi-part presentation. So consequently, I am doing probably a different version or a different media with my next presentation. So let's begin. So there we are. This is a topic I'm really surprised there's not more research or information. And once again, this is an overview. I'm trying to provide a general historical impression, but the presentation will attempt to provide a broad view of the global political cartoons of that period. But it's not a simple topic either, as I originally thought. It'd be very simple to put something together. The research was far more complex and far more extended than I thought. And it's limited to opinion cartoons and illustrations. There are far more cartoons that are out there than I could ever consider. And I also tried to, when I did this, everyone who does a presentation has biases and such. I tried to stay neutral on some of these because some of them definitely have a political slant. Now, amazingly, I only used two sources for this presentation. They were both discovered using books.google.com, and I had access to others, but these really allowed me to concentrate on what I was doing. One is Cartoons Magazine, and the other is Jugend, meaning youth, from Germany. It's a Munich journal newspaper that was all things of German art and humor, where Cartoons Magazine was more of a full, compilation of various different cartoons of the prior months, as well as about news about the cartoons and artists in general. And these also included political artists as well. There's a few generalities I need to make sure that there's a commonality with the message on both sides, whether you're positive or negative. Stereotypes, racist, and demeaning nationalist portraiture were common portrayals of individuals and countries. And the artist generally always portrays a biased viewpoint, whether it's correct or not. And there are some that of the images that don't date well because of these biases. Some of the topics are just as relevant today as the topic and scope of the period. Newspapers back then were like cable news, and political illustrations were a powerful force in their own right. And some people say, even today, that visuals are far more powerful than written stories. But at the same time, because of this, there were attempts to control and censor. The Swiss had their neutrality biases, and they didn't really want to upset either the French or the Germans. So consequently, many a time, they would not allow cartoons or art to be posted because they would violate what they considered their own neutrality. And the British monarchy, as well as the effects of the DORA, Defense of the Realm Act, also put a damper on many of the more slanted political cartoons that might have been coming out of Britain. And then even states like Alabama, they introduced legislation that would have made it illegal for an artist to create a portraiture or caricature of anyone that was a public figure or a legislature of the Alabama legislation. And that did not pass, but it's interesting that that's how far some states would go. And you'd have both propaganda and reflected opinion out of these as well. The communication methods were usually a dark humor, an illusion, distraction from an actual event, sometimes a backhanded a compliment, but generally there would always be a sense of patriotic fervor. Artists like Paulu used children or animals instead of the actuality of the horrors of war at times, where the others would just use insult and incitement to get their message. And really, Charlie and I were talking before the presentation began, it ran from high art to cartoon styles, and there were some artists that actually did both more art and they and also turned to political cartoons to make their money. There are consistent stereotypes for this period too. John Bull or a bulldog were consistent images that utilized to recognize the Britain, as well as a soldier in a kilt to recognize the British Army. Germany was consistent with the Kaiser or the Crown Prince. Austro-Hungary with Franz Joseph. You'd also find both of those countries with pickelhaube helmets to get their point across. In the United States, there was Uncle Sam and Woodrow Wilson, or the ma and pa ethic that would sometimes be used. And when we find the feather plumed hat soldier or a Roman figure, those were usually indicating Italian. On the other hand, you had Turkey with the Sultan or Arabic influence or a person in a fez. The image of liberty of Marianne or the Poilu were also common for the French. Russia was always a bear, the Tsar, or more often at times in a more disparaging, was the drunk Cossack. And these views are often meant to demonize or insult, as I said earlier. My presentation is between 1913 to early 1919, and there's somewhat chronology with what I'm going to be showing, but I sometimes group things together to keep coherence of message. And I do include non-war but relevant topics. And some of the individuals are lost to history, where the best example is the GOP candidate for 1916, Charles Evan Hughes. Nobody remembers who ran against Woodrow Wilson in 1916. And like I said, the source were newspapers and journals from around the world using Cartoons magazine or Young. So the news themes were generally consistent per country. Like in the United States, it was food prices and the cost of living. There was the ongoing Mexican problems in 1913 and 14, critiques or glorification for Wilson in his first year, the labor troubles, automobile safety, and you would find an ongoing theme of U.S. military preparedness even back then. Usually spoke about Mexico, but at the same time, talking about in reference to Germany or Britain's naval capabilities. So in Europe, on the other hand, many of the topics before the war were things like women's suffrage, the labor and strikes that were occurring, and also the ships and trade industries that were going on, which were also true for Germany. Both of those topics of Britain were also true for Germany. Now, I sort of conflate these two with the Balkan troubles, with the ongoing Albanian assassinations that were happening, seemed to be continuous in that pre-war period, to Austro-Hungary, which was just getting over the Balkan War of 1912. Russia was just ongoing disagreement and the ferment of potential revolution down the road. And then there was the imperialist Japan versus the China Revolution or the collapse of the Chinese Empire, a better way to say it. So here we see what old is new. We see 1913 coming in, and this is, they use technology consistently to show progress. And so you see the flying car, leaving the old man holding Earth for 1913. But at the same time, you see the Ma and Pa image, him driving his fancy big car with the allegory of the cost of living as the car and the various different things as he gets ready to hit the thumbtack of his budget, but the cost of everything, where the thumbtack is Ma's Christmas budget. Now, I had to mention this. This is the prices of eggs. You see two political cartoons where there is one, he's putting the eggs into a safety deposit box, and the other is the gentleman is being guarded by two policemen as he's walking down the street holding his eggs. If you can't really see it, but the eggs that's going into the safety deposit box were listed as 65 cents a dozen. 65 cents a dozen, adjusted for inflation, would have been about $20 American at that time. The next thing is that many people forget that in 1913 was the introduction from as an amendment to the Constitution for income tax. And so you see Uncle Sam rolling over the income tax regulations and trying to figure them out. But at the same time, technology again, and the trying to figure out what to do about the issues of deaths on the road from the car wrecks and such that were becoming a major issue. Suffragism was also an ongoing topic at the time. They have two different, one where a woman is trying to get the ear of Congress, but the other is where you have the Southern Democrats hiding behind the door of universal suffrage, not wanting to let the woman in for the very reason of the fear of the colored vote of the South. And it's kind of hard to see, but the racist stereotype of the two African American couple is really, very demeaning of that period, but very typical. And finally, you have to consider something I find rather amusing: the tango. There were, for a period of time, the tango was a big scandal, and so these two political cartoons captured both, where the Kaiser and the Queen of England were both really upset with the tango and dancing with the woman, but at the same time, the other images of how people perceived the tango in the top image, but the reality was it was very much of a procedural dance. But of course, we have to consider Mexico. Now, the first one of Mexico, where you have the nationalists running across the border to the United States, and from the bandits of Mexico. But at the same time, it says the Mexicans distrust the United States, but at the same time, it's until they need a safe haven, was the topic of what was the text below. But then you show more of a critique of Wilson in his first year of office, reading a book on how to ride the horse of Mexico. And that the text at the bottom says, he says, "I wonder what I do next." And so the logic is that he doesn't really know what he's doing. Here we see the dictators of Mexico and China on a motorcycle running down the hill over the cliff that says danger. And that the front wheel says Mexico, the back says China, and behind them are little leaflets that chase them for all the problems that they're facing. At the same time, you have Uncle Sam chasing more of a Chilean view of the Monroe Doctrine, of which is what the butterfly net is, and that chasing after the various butterflies of the countries in South America as well as Mexico. Finally, we talk about the Caribou incident. Now, some of you that are listening may be familiar with the Society of Caribou for those military individuals who served in the Philippines. They're eligible to join, and it was a result of the Philippines becoming a territory and part of the Spanish American War. And so, consequently, there was the Caribou incident, which the this was the on the cover of the menu, but more importantly, they sang some songs that were satires and sort of criticizing Wilson for how he was handling things. He was so angry by it that he literally had everyone that was attending or a member apologize to him, which, it sort of spoke to his personal level of not being happy with them. This is a sort of a double image in its own way because it puts the literacy test for the immigrant, where the immigrant is actually an anarchist creating a dynamite bomb, or the labor dynamiter pushing the bomb up the hill for his utopia. The, they're basically the same topic of trying to make the labor or the immigrant be a negative image, and that they're anarchists, whether they're a labor union or an immigrant. So let's talk about Europe. And there, many of the same topics that faced them before the war: anarchists and labor troubles, military preparedness, with us against them, imperialism of Germany and Britain, and the potential war and smaller wars, where you have this is a view of the Olympics by a Hungarian, where it would be nothing but handicapped individuals playing in the Olympics for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then at the same time, the new king of Albania trying to introduce himself to his subjects as they assassinate another person. That it was still a turmoil for that period. Then you have the idea of diplomacy, where John Bull is considered a check against supposedly some type of ruffian or anarchist. At the same time, the John Bull's giving himself a prize for his diplomacy. You also have the three imperialist powers, as named in this political cartoon, of Britain, America, and United States and Germany, with the heads of Tibet, the Philippines, and German Southwest Africa. And it was basically a critique of, considering themselves the leading imperialists of the time. Now, Russia was, there was this bias against Russia at the time of, while Mendel Bliss was acquitted for a murder charge, it did nothing to assuage the attitude of the ongoing Jewish pogroms and Jewish persecution that was being done by the Russian government and by the Russian people. And the Germans had a fairly dim view of suffragism themselves. And so this was their attitude about how the Bobbies should take care of the women who were the suffragettes protesting in Britain at the time. Now, keep in mind that Germans' universal suffragism didn't occur until 1918 as well. But Germany didn't have very high opinion of its neighbors, where this is before the war. They portrayed the French, the Russians, and the British as warmonger monsters for all intents and purposes. And as such, both Britain and Germany did not want to attend the Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco because they didn't want to deal with either of the other. There was also this sort of fear of imperialist Japan right before the war, and it was getting to be a very hot topic in the United States, where you had William James Bryant, Wilson, as well as I think Conover is his name. We don't want to hurt the feelings of Japan, and the fear of a warmongering Japan that might take over, China. But then the assassination of Franz Ferdinand happens, and the attitude that was initially was this sorrow and prayer for peace on earth and goodwill towards men. This continued on. If you notice that the color image is a December 1914 image from Cartoons magazine, and war had obviously been going on for 3 months, but the United States were hoping for a peaceful resolution even then. So the war begins. There's a high level of optimism, which we know by Germany. And so one shows the German soldiers marching to war with two rifles, one for the French and one for the Russians, because they'd be fighting both at the same time. And the other is that the civilian is asking, what do you think will get through the French? And they said, we'll hit them so hard they'll have to advertise enemies wanted. But the French didn't have that same attitude. Their attitude towards the Germans was very much of the cowardice and them running away when they were confronted. But unfortunately, the tragic tale of Belgium and the invasion of Belgium, you have Belgium appearing to stand alone against the bayonets of the German soldiers with ruins behind, or the Kaiser saying, my heart bleeds for Antwerp also, but you see this Zeppelins bombing in the air, as well as the destruction below. Well, back in the United States, though, Ford at that point was being considered, Henry Ford was being considered a socialist for some of his ideas of making an improved labor force. And so consequently, there was all of these different demands that were feared being made. It's similar to today's demands of a $15 an hour minimum wage. But the youngster is saying, I want a fair shake of the profits of the farm, $5 a day, and basically making demands to be paid equal to what his worth is. On the other side, though, is there were the war alarmists that were saying, fight, fight, with Uncle Sam standing in front of the soldiers with the soldiers behind, ready to give the sacrifice. But Uncle Sam is saying, not if I can help it. All was not going well for Britain or France, we all know, but the Emden sinking was at the end of 1914 was a huge joy by the Australian Navy, and then the Americans portrayed it as a lion cub, eating the whatever was the Emden, or the Emden sunk down by the ship of the Confederate ship, the Alabama. So we end in 1914, we go into 1915, and there was a fear of Turkey entering the war that it would be sort of create two scenarios. One was that Turkey would just literally be cutting their heads off, or the other was is that Turkey would set forth a jihad, holy war against the French and the British. So we have 1915 with the World War, except for the neutrals, of course, and all was not going well for Austria-Hungary at the very beginning. And so there were a number of cartoons. The second one is from Punch in England, where that Serbia is giving Austria a spanking, where the Austrian disaster in their battles. But the Austrians didn't see it that way because they felt like they wanted the Russian generals to be sent back, because if they could have more Russian generals like the ones they took prisoner, that literally caused these huge amounts of men killed or taken prisoner, they would surely win the war. The tragedy of Belgium, as well as the potential war crimes that were being uh, done at the time, that the idea of poison gas at the bottom, child impaled on a bayonet, as well as other things that were considered horrific, and that the Belgians of starving, who will feed the Belgians then? The British were taking a more of a long-term view, but they were having problems with whether to go with conscription. And so consequently, this came out of Punch as well, where it was a great chance for the Union Scottish with congratulations to Sir John French, but at the same time, the soldier is saying, hey, if you think he's doing such a great job, sign up yourself. And that there was a certain level of putting the idea of femininity or being not very tough of the Scottish soldiers. And the text is basically, I don't know about you, Sep, but they would probably win the county fair if they were entered there. And then also you had the insulting attitude towards the Prince of Wales at the time, who didn't know how to ride a horse or use a gun, where he's asked, Mom, what is a gun? And but at the same time, these two cartoons were named at the time as one of the biggest boosts to morale at the time. One was the Half a Mo Kaiser saying that they're going to not be persuaded to act in haste, and the other one was of a new soldier joining as an old hand in the trenches, and he's describing what's happening. He says, "Oh, sounds like a bit of right. I'm on it." The French were being not very highly thought of, though, once again by the Germans, where you have the statement of, "I remember this." My father remembers this prisoner of war camp. He was here in 1870, implying that the French were losing big time. And then the last conscript is a child that's being put, cleaned and putting a diaper on under the trenches. At the same time, the Germans were, at their best and peak in early 1915, and so they were literally crushing the Russian steamroller. And there were, I nearly put the other cartoon that more than a few of expecting the Russian steamroller to make a mincemeat out of the German army, but we all know that did not happen. And then the thing of another German, more of a humor magazine, saying he misses the days of war because as a Cossack, because it was easier to plunder during times of peace. The Germans, though, did not think highly at all, and this is one of the you know creating dehumanization of towards the Japanese at the time, where they considered them nothing but monkeys, or in the other image, rats being led by the Pied Piper of Britain to battle. The French considered their French 75, though, as their weapon of war that really was bringing to bear on the Germans. And once again, it was one of those things that you'll see again. The French were always very optimistic in their images that I could find of war. Once again, the tragedies of the war and war crimes stated of the Germans using a human shield of civilians to march into a town, or finding children dead and impaled by bayonets by the supposedly by the German soldiers. Italy, it was interesting because they were still neutral at that time, and it makes for a certain interesting, discussion there, because you see the same two individuals of one where they're soldiers or they are one is a worker and the other is bourgeois, and that the idea of war makes for a certain equality, while peace knows no such thing. So it's both making the idea of war more palatable, but at the same time they're trying to avoid war itself. The Japanese, though, they were not entirely enthused themselves, though, about going to war because they feared themselves being nothing but tools for the French and the British while they're doing the fighting where the French and British are enjoying their banquet down below. But above, in the other image, is the Japanese pilots and planes keeping the German Eagle at bay at Guangzhou in China. Chile had the attitude that it was nothing but death playing a game of bowling and knocking down the pins of Austria, France, Germany, and that it was a game for death. Now, on the other hand, we get into the issue of trade, and what you see there is uh, Uncle Sam trying to complain the John Bull with his bulldog, complaining about the goose that has been plundered by the bulldog, with the Dutch in their windmill in the far background. And this was done by a Dutch artist, and he says, "I say, John, call off your dog," meaning the combination of, at this time, the blockades of Britain as well as such. The United States was wanting to do nothing but the free trade between all those involved. Now, I spoke earlier a bit about high art. Louis Raymakers is a very influential artist that came out of the war, but he also made his living as a political cartoonist. And the first one is taken from an actual event. And I think that there was a British movie named King of Hearts that spoke to this very image, that the insane were released from this one hospital and that they were released as a whole. And that she's saying, "Oh, what a jolly war." And it's obviously she's mad. And at the other side, there is the German general Bernhardism saying, "Well, if I hadn't done it, someone else would," meaning that if Germany hadn't started the war, someone else would have done it, sort of trying to transition the blame or transfer the blame to someone else. But the center is a painting of the Widows, which is one of Louis Raymaker's more famous paintings that came out of the war. The British, though, on the other hand, were generally tried for humor with their political cartoons, and this one speaks well towards that, where it's the leaders of Turkey, Germany, and Austria-Hungary all singing the same song, "We want hate and we won't wait." Punch was a very influential, and their art for their political cartoons are so detailed it amazes me, and even today, and it's similar to the ones that you saw from the Franco-Prussian War or even the 1854 war. This one, the first one is that Kaiser Wilhelm is trying to get a ticket to uh, Calais, to Warsaw, to Paris, and the line is blocked. And he said, "But I must go somewhere. I promised the people I would." And the other one is portraying Wilhelm as nothing but a droll uh, comedian singing a song that, "Has anybody seen Calais?" Meaning that he has not made it there. The Americans, as a whole, were doing their best to maintain their neutrality, and that you had the war alarmists in this picture of the junkyard dog trying to get after Uncle Sam. At the same time, Woodrow Wilson standing firm at the top of a fortress turret that saying, keep, the sleepless sentinel. But the Americans had their mind on other things, such as the Eastland disaster. The Eastland disaster was, one of those events of incompetence or poor management where this tourist barge tipped over in Cleveland, Ohio, and it had over 2,000 individuals on board the ship. 900 perished, and they were only 30 feet away from the docks. But at the same time, you have Uncle Sam not looking happy with Mexico and Germany on his mind, using the images of the pickle hub and the sombrero. Now, one of the topics that I hear, they talk about America First being a modern topic or even one that dates to the 1930s. I would disagree definitely with this because the American First was something that came out of both the whole hyphenated American, and the hyphenated American was the Italian American, the German American, all of these Americans that were associated with their ancestry of where they came from, the Irish American. But the most sensitivity was dealing with the German American at the time. And so you have Count Reventlow, who was a Danish journalist and one that was here in the United States promoting neutrality, but they were trying to get him to understand that in the United States he's a German American during times of peace, but if we come to war, we will be soldiers. Something that is I had not really understood well when I first started doing this years ago was how the profits of and these booming harvests of the 19 teens, at the same time, there were individuals in the United States that were having difficulty getting the needed grains and needed foodstuffs to feed America. And so it was this attitude of, yes, you can feed with this, wealth of harvest, but at the same time, we need to be considering the vast wheat to go to the Americans as well. Once again, sort of an American first logic. Now, again, in that was sort of the disparity of you have the trade where John Bull is sitting on the hat of Uncle Sam trying to quash any trade, but at the same time, what was being taken was it was sort of just charge it, and Uncle Sam is not happy about the increasing debt. And there were a number of cartoons that were showing the disparity of debt between both Germany and the United States and Britain and the United States that was just piling up because of the war. And we'll talk about that in a bit too, but here we have once again the Monroe Doctrine in Mexico. Uncle Sam, they were thinking that it would be a peace patrol that would help resolve the Mexico problems, which in this instance, it's a drunk Mexican. And the peace patrol is supposed to come send the wagon and pick him up. But at the same time, the Count Ernstlow was the ambassador to the United States who said that the Monroe Doctrine should not interfere with their interests. So at the same time, the war is happening, and you have the destruction that, once again, they use technology rather than the trenches themselves of the images of both the bombing of Britain with the Zeppelins as well as the bombing in the areas of Belgium and such. So we come to the sinking of the Lusitania. And the sinking of the Lusitania, I could fill almost an entire presentation with the various different images that came out of that. But at the same time, this cover, once again, from Cartoon Magazine covers it quite well. But in the opposite next image, you have the attitude of Williams Jennings Bryan being a bully towards the small individual of Mexico, where being just a little man to trying to take care of Wilhelm and the Crown Prince. But at the same time, the image of the evil villain from these the serial films of that period, but with being the ghost saying, "But why did you kill us?" This in turn forced Jennings Bryan out with the white feather, and the white feather is used over and over again to indicate both cowardice and he's going off on his Chautauqua circuit, and that later it sort of killed his career of his wanting universal peace. At the same time, you have sort of a Kaiser image of a Roman death saying, "Don't worry, I'll be back," and going to the Americas. The end result was is that Woodrow Wilson wrote a number of notes to the various complaining, and so Britain in these two cartoons gave their opinion of how it was being taken. That the Kaiser was thumbing his nose and laughing at Woodrow Wilson with his peacock feather in his hand, or uh, Kaiser was saying, "Please, just let me do it for 3 years or until I win the war, just to keep as a whole." But in the end, the thoughts were that the messages might show light on the Lusitania, but the reality was it was the shark fin of the U-boat. Finally, towards the end of the year, we have the execution of Edith Cavell, and it was getting. I would have to say this group of cartoons were sort of muted in the protests by the Americans as a whole, because I think there was a rising anger that you could see in the political cartoons against the Lusitania as well as the blockades, both by Britain and by Germany. So, 1916, though things are both changing, there were the Irish troubles with the Easter Massacre, but there was more of the same though with the attempt for Verdun. And in the United States, it's an election year, and then there's Mexico, and so we look at the Easter Massacre of 1916 of Ireland, and both the idea of them splitting up Ulster with a pair of scissors, with the Irish idea of peace, saying, "No, do not. We need a united Ireland, one and indefensible." At the same time, the general being, you know, rebuking John Bull for his on humanity and civilization for his actions in Ireland. So here we are in May, and the election's coming up, and that Woodrow Wilson makes a statement. "I do not know what the people are thinking about," and this statement was used against him, and the Uncle Sam is giving us sort of a frowny look, saying, "Well, I reckon we will come November." And then at the same time, once again, the champion of everything, all those individuals who have received notes are laughing at the. So it's Trimble Boys. Here's the author of all those notes. Once again, we have the issue of uh, the Dutch journalist who was actually promoting, the German America, such being locked out of the GOP politics just because it was considered too sensitive. But at the same time, Hughes does a clean sweep where he knocks out Teddy Roosevelt. The bull mooses are standing by. They can't do a thing because they couldn't find a place at either the Democrat or the Republican convention. The favorite sons were swept out as well. And so that was the idea of the topic for end result of the GOP convention, where at the same time, the Democratic convention was a complete harmony, and ignore all those things that have been said or done, which are on the board above, such as watchful waiting, too proud to fight, uh, and those type of logic. At the same time, they didn't know it was going to be Hughes yet, but so what did they do? They knew it was going to be Wilson. And once again, the American first. And so the teacher is saying, write something that uses a sentence containing the word America. And they're both writing, I'm for America first. So here you have Hughes and Teddy having an argument about see what Wilson has done, and that the idea is that they're trying to blame him for all these different things, such as the submarine massacres, the German conspiracies, and such in the United States, revolution in Mexico, and the bandit raids. But at the same time, it's the shadow, the indication it's the shadow of the Kaiser that's over both of them. And then you have, once again, the Dutch with his goose stepping saying, I'm for Charles Hughes. So the reality is that, yes, if you're for Hughes, you're actually for Germany. Once again, we have the America First, and that this was with the title of the America Message. Now, the other one I had to put in because there was this continuing theme over the 1913 through 1916 that were talking about the lack of preparedness. But there was a definite lobby, and whether if you remember the song, I Did Not Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier, and other things like that that actually were it was music to their ears, and how gratifying that the United States was not ready. And you'd see that in some of the other political cartoons. We can't forget the Armenian massacre, and that really did set off a number of political cartoons against Turkey, and it sort of hardened their heart, and it sort of speaks to I would say, the anti-Arab motto and logic of that period as well. That it was a true suspicion, but this for the United States truly made it much harder attitude against Turkey. But at the same time, you have the Verdun event, and these two sides speak towards both. One is of the German saying, just listen to the talking heads of Asquith and can't remember who the other person is, but they are doing, just speaking off hot air, where the German soldier is going to pounce and take control of the French soldier. But at the same time, the Italians had it fairly well, where they show that 1 foot per day, and it's only 250 kilometers to Paris. Let's speak a bit of the uh, French images. And the French images what I spoke of earlier, and they're always optimistic, even in the mud and such, and that they are trying to do their best of showing the love of family. The French soldier that is, marching through the snow, I mean, through the mud with a heavy load. And that is the artist Louis Icart is the artist for that political cartoon. Another fairly famous artist who went to political cartoons as well, just to make money during that time period. Now, something that was sort of suppressed but not is the issue of the bread riots in Britain, I mean, in Germany at the time. That you have the official communique and the right image that says bountiful harvests are being helping fight the war in Germany, but a clubbed hand is sticking through the window that says bread riots, where the other one of the soldier or the civilian all beat up, and the two women are talking, and she said, "How did he get so beat up?" And he said, "Was it in Calais or in Serbia? No, he was getting bread." So once again, the subhumanization of Germans utilized, and that it's using the zoo allegory of all of the prisoners are down with the various different idea that the cultural alliance of the war prisoners with the German soldier looking down. Japan was dealing with its own imperialist notes, as I said, from the United States, but they were pushing back themselves. And so you see the one image of the two political cartoons of the Uncle Sam getting ready to beat on the soldier, and it's basically be careful or you'll cut your hand. And the other is of playing tetherball and getting hit, not watching what they're doing. At the same time, the other is of the the soldiers of that the Russian soldiers are carrying the Germans back and forth, and the Germans are carrying the Russians back and forth. But in the end, all they're really doing is digging trenches. Finally, let's get back to Mexico, because we all know that during that time period was the U.S. incursion to Pancho Villa and to take care of the problems. It's really hard. Once again, there are so many political cartoons trying to encapsulate that into one. Whether it is the issue of the conditions of the National Guard or soldiers that were not given proper, room and board while they were down there during the incursion, to other issues of the lack of different things. And so you have this image where you have Pancho Villa being thought of being everywhere, but the idea of Mexico being self-governed was similar to a monkey with a top hat on. Once again, sort of making a people sort of subhuman. There's a mood shift in 1917, and it's more obvious when you look in hindsight, but that it might not be as obvious for then. But patience and energy is running thin, and but at the same time, America's finally entering the war because they recognize they've had enough, and that hope with America entering, but is happening, but it's not happening fast enough. And so you have at Christmas of 16 the mother and children having a wonderful Christmas, looking to the east of Europe with the trials and death overhead in Europe. At the same time, begin 1917, and this sort of spoke to it all once again with Mexico. It's the same image saying, conditions 3 years ago, condition 2 years ago, conditions 1 year ago, and current conditions. And it's the same image of the people are suffering with destruction, anarchy, and such. The Mexicans, soldiers are fighting among themselves, and you have the American interest being done and the foreign interest being done in Mexico, but no real change from 1913 to 1917. We move on to Germany, and their lines of cartoons, at least that are being presented, at least the ones that I find, are being far more propagandish of, not trying to, provide positive notes, but sort of a stiff upper lip, where you have the U-boats pulling the British naval monster down and then in the other one of the British ship sunk. But the reality is that the British were finally getting a handle on the U-boats, and that it was more of a problem. At the same time, you have the two images of the Americans showing that the Kaiser having the Riga success of a pillow, the German success of a tattered blanket, and then the uncovered feet of the Austrian reverses. And it spoke to the problems once again of what is a success for Germany at that time. But the idea that's being presented to Germany is that it's the watchful soldier looking over France and as a whole. But there's starting to be a change even then, because you see in Germany a political cartoon showing an Aladdin rubbing a lamp, and his three wishes are abundance of food being brought to him uh, out of Bulgaria, because of Bulgaria is just changed from being a pseudo neutral to being on the side of the uh, Triple Alliance. But at the same time, you have the Kaiser holding the German people with iron gloves close to his heart. This one, I'm really trying to show the different disagreement. You have the Wall Street not being happy with the idea of peace proposals that were being put out by Germany, or the idea of peace because it would impact profit. But at the same time, this is a little bit later where war is declared, but Wall Street's not happy there either, because don't you love me anymore type logic, where the idea of the war means that they're going to have their profits impacted as well and controlled. So it's sort of, you can't win for losing in Wall Street logic. Once again, we have Louis Remaker with his political cartoons. At this point, he's uh, doing political cartoons for the Philadelphia Ledger. And the first one is obviously Woodrow Wilson in chaps and such, appearing much larger to the Kaiser, where the other one is Columbia embracing Marianne of France and saying, I'm here, and when I was a child, it was you who helped me in my hour of need. The Germans weren't happy about this, obviously, but they had the attitude of Woodrow Wilson basically being a magician and trying to turn things inside out, but in the end, he eats his model rather than doing any real magic trick. Where, on the other hand, is the idea of universal conscription is Uncle Sam takes down the idea of universal service and puts up the rifle of a volunteer service, of an old rifle versus a modern rifle. Now, we're, we're seeing in 1917 the two attitudes that were happening. You have the uh, satire of the Germans making fun of the campaign hat that looks sort of like the Boy Scouts. So they said the French thought the Boy Scouts had come to town when they arrived. But at the same time, you have the Americans parading in London, and Kaiser is beseeching the lead soldier with the flag, saying, "I'm supposed to be doing that," and it speaks too well to that topic and image. The French, on the other hand, recognized that help was coming, and so the first political cartoon of a Sammy in a campaign hat waving to the soldiers in the trench, saying, "Hold on, we're coming." But the Poilu is not necessarily entirely happy, because he's sort of saying, "Hey, that's you may love the French woman, but I did you not come over here to fight the French? I mean, fight the Germans?" Or a lower image where the two American soldiers at a cafe, where the woman says, "I think I will have an American." Now, this one next is interesting because it speaks to the whatever serves its purpose, where the IWW was considered evil and later associated with the Bolsheviks because of the workers' union. But here, they're associated being nothing but a front for the Kaiser, and at the same time, with their coming to Washington with some of their few representatives of hot air, and instead of the international workers, they are I waste weeks, and that the idea is to make progress on the food bill would be nothing but a wasted effort. So we end 1917 with two different images, one coming out of Russia, which was a recruitment poster after the revolution to help bring stability, and it was called a Liberty Loan poster actually, and it says "Down with the foe," and it was not against the foe of Germany. It was against the internal foe. Where at the same time, the Russian bear drinking the bottle of anarchy, where the German in the background, and the idea of anarchy being the new vodka. So we come to 1918. 1918 is unique in its own way because the idea of propaganda and such just becomes overwhelming at the time, and that they are literally functionally, we're getting close to the end. But at the same time, you have the idea of prohibition is just around the corner. So they are literally chopping the neck off of the liquor suppliers in the food bill for 1918, and the same way that they are the from the satire of the famous picture of the individuals marching together, but it's distilled liquor and whiskey being marched out of town. The next is a marine poster, which I think the museum actually has. But the other is interesting because there was this attitude at one point for the Woodrow Wilson government to either take control or provide greater oversight to utilities and to the railroads. And so it's the in the tower, which switch? One switch says government control of the rails, the other says government oversight. So you then have the two images of work or fight. You have the slacker who is trying to decide which uniform to wear, or the slacker who is being blown away that he to win the war that he must make a decision. Germany is doing its best to keep us once again a stiff upper lip, but they're trying to use like other themes, and where this is Woodrow Wilson puts Red Cross armbands on all of the pilots, and that wishes them well, and then a week following, he's with a bleeding heart holds a meeting of protest against the abominable Huns who actually sunk a hospital ship disregarding international law. And again, they're showing the image of Britain being on its last legs, and that the woman to be Britain is just literally needing a drink, or the British Navy with a small mousetrap with all these rats that are coming to take over the little lifeboat. Then you have the Germans changing fronts, and so the Russians are supposedly wishing them well as they march to the Russian front. But Germany still had this attitude of trying to take over Italy, and the idea was that they would be, nothing but the writing piggyback. But at the same time, they were complaining about the use of Americans of using the shotgun. And they use that, he's speaking, and all of the different Germans are crying foul, listing all the different things that the bombing of Red Cross, the sinker of ships, use of chemical weapons and such. But at the same time, it was thought that Germany was in Russia, this political cartoon was getting ready to cut off both sides at their knees that were arguing, and they were just above the clouds, not thinking about the reality. But the Germans had a very negative attitude about the Red Guards, where you see their attitude was that they were nothing but a wolf pack that had taken over. You have two interesting images. If you notice, the African American, one of the African American soldiers who won the French War Cross, being glorified and getting praise, but he's not in an Adrian helmet, unlike what they really would have been in. But at the same time, you have the American soldier who thinks that a grenade being thrown at him is nothing but a baseball to hit with his stock of his gun. The final few images is that it's showing the breakdown of the different lines, the Siegfried line, the Wotan line, the Hindenburg line, all the way back to Berlin. And at the same time, you have the Austrian Empire falling apart, where you have the Czechoslovaks wanting their own the potential of self-determination, which is what the food is in that dish. I have to include this of a gentleman sneezing, and they depart and leave the subway for the couple, and he says, "It's a gift. I can sneeze when I want to." And everybody says, "He has a Spanish flu." At the same time, you have Uncle Sam boarding up all of the aliens, which is something of the Enemy Alienate Registration Act in my prior presentation, and this speaks to basically trying to keep them contained. But we are at the end of the war, and you have German soil where you have the patriotic of the American who has won. And I leave you with it's still true today of that's some puzzle, and it shows Russia being bounced out of the puzzle, and all the other countries, and he's trying, the peace conference is trying to make a way to get permanent peace in the center. Thank you very much. I'd take any questions you have, if you have any.
Very good, Steve. Thank you. I do. It, it's always interesting to go back and try to put yourself in the mind of people then, and you kind of realize that so much of the politics was actually revolved around what we would consider parochial or non-war related questions. There was a whole thing of um, the liquor question, of prohibition, of there's a whole Mexico thing, the invasion of Mexico, and the troubles with Mexico. And then there's the immigration thing, which became a question after the war, which was as big a political issue in the early 1920s as it is today. I think it's fascinating to realize that people were making decisions in those days, not just on the basis of the war itself or the threat of war and then the war itself, but the they were making a lot of their decisions based on whatever the local politics were or the national politics without reference to the war.
That's so true. And to your point, that's where I spoke at the very beginning, using the theme of egg prices, what old is new again. It's the same issue as that so many of the topics that I sort of covered were actually could easily be modern topics to discuss of today's issues.
Did the United States appoint an official war cartoonist?
There were no official war cartoonists that I could find. There were individuals that did posters that could be considered close to war cartoonists or war artists, but they were ones that you would see for recruitment posters. And they weren't so much for political cartoonists.
Oh, it was just that as soon as I see cartoons in the First World War, my first thought goes to Bruce Bairnsfather um, and Old Bill, and the effect on morale that his cartoons had. And so I suppose, although he wouldn't have thought of himself as being a political, um, it certainly helped boost morale amongst the troops at the time, and therefore could be viewed as being political. And they stand the test of time when you look at them now, not least because Ben's father had himself been there and was wounded. And it was whilst he was convalescing back home in Britain that he got the appointment as the official war cartoonist.
I would agree. The issue, and as you are well aware, the ethic of the British of that period versus the ethic of the United States is just as different then as it is for today. Of trying for an American to understand where someone from Britain is thinking or someone from Scotland is thinking is almost otherworldly.
Yes, and two nations divided by a common language.
Indeed.
In the case of the British and the Scots, I'm not sure that they even have a common language.
No.
Well, Stephen, this was really good. It's just fascinating to see all of these things that you put together. I
Thank
think
you.
this is just an excellent lecture, and we all thank you for putting all of this together and giving it to us.
Thank you.
I'm going to.